Welcome to Podcast 3000, the place for meaningful chats and talks on the net. Enjoy our food for thought.
Kenya, a holiday destination for many people. They travel to this beautiful country for safaris, to go to the beach, or to visit Nairobi. Relaxation and entertainment. However, there is another, darker, and almost unknown side of this country. The year 2024 in Kenya was marked by unrest, protests, and, yes, even deaths at the hands of the police. Opposition members were killed, and dozens of government opponents were kidnapped. To this day, on January 5, 2025, there are still people whose whereabouts are unknown, and even whether they are still alive. Thomas Schwartz has just written an opinion piece on this topic on his homepage, thomasschwartzbond.de. Erica and David discuss the debate, the state of democracy in Kenya, and Thomas Schwartz's opinion on the matter in their latest podcast, Deep Dive.
All right, welcome to your Deep Dive. Kenya's on the agenda today. It's a country that's, well, it's facing some pretty serious unrest, but it's barely getting any attention, any coverage, really, in Western media.
Yeah, that's right.
And you guys have sent in some really fascinating stuff, news articles, transcripts from YouTube, and even some super in-depth reports, like the one from Human Rights Watch. That was pretty intense.
Absolutely. I think it's safe to say there's a lot more going on beneath the surface than most people realize.
Definitely. And that's why we're here. It's time to understand the real story, the story that's actually unfolding in Kenya.
Yeah, let's get into it.
So our journey starts, I guess you can say, with those massive protests that kind of gripped the country back in the summer of 2024.
Right.
Yeah.
Those are something else. Initially, it all started because of this thing called the finance bill. The government's proposal, if it had actually gone through, would have hiked taxes like crazy for everyday Kenyans, I mean.
Yeah, I was reading about that. But it sounds like it became about a lot more than just money, right?
You got it.
Yeah.
It really tapped into this underlying frustration, this discontent with the people in charge, the leadership,
Yeah.
President William Ruto, when he came into office, he made all these promises, right, about tackling corruption, improving the lives of ordinary Kenyans.
Right.
But his critics, they're saying that, well, his actions don't really match his words.
Ah, I see. And speaking of that finance bill, what kind of, how would that have impacted people? What kind of tax hikes are we talking about here?
Oh, man. Well, there was this provision in there. It would have increased the VAT, value-added tax on like essential stuff, fuel, food, that kind of thing.
Oh, wow.
Which, that would have hit lower-income households hard. The people who are already struggling,
Right.
to make ends meet. And then they were going to slap on these new levies on mobile money transactions. And that's a service a lot of Kenyans rely on, especially in rural areas.
Yeah, I can see why people would be upset.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense why they took to the streets.
Totally. And we're not talking about like small little protests here and there. These were massive, huge. They brought Nairobi's financial district, like the whole thing, to a standstill.
Wow.
The government actually had to withdraw the finance bill because of it.
Really?
Which, I mean, that speaks volumes, right, about the power of people when they come together.
Yeah, that's a pretty impressive victory for the protesters.
Yeah.
But then things got a little dark, didn't they?
Sadly, yeah. While, many of the protests were peaceful, there were definitely some violent clashes, especially with the police.
Yeah.
The Kenyan National Commission on Human Rights, KNCHR, they documented at least 39 deaths during those protests.
39. That's a lot.
Yeah.
Were there any other estimates for the death toll, I mean?
Yeah, there were. And this is where it gets a little concerning, I guess. The Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLED, they're an organization that tracks this kind of stuff. Political violence, protests all over the world. They reported 42 deaths. And then Human Rights Watch, the International Human Rights Organization, their number's even higher. They're saying 73.
Okay, that's a pretty big difference. How do we make sense of that?
It's hard to say for sure. Underreporting definitely could be a factor. Things were pretty chaotic And there's always the possibility that authorities might try to downplay the number of casualties. But, also the way each organization gathers and verifies information, that could play a role too. Different methodologies, things like that.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. So, okay, so we may not know the exact number, but it's clear that people lost their lives.
Absolutely.
And then it got even more intense.
Yeah.
With those abductions.
Right. Yeah, the abduction.
What I find so disturbing about this is that it wasn't just important figures, high-profile people.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing reports of opposition politicians, activists, students, even just everyday citizens
Right.
being taken.
It's terrifying.
It is.
Yeah.
And nobody seems to know why. I mean, the sources I was looking at, they mentioned 82 documented abductions.
Yeah.
And another 29 people who are still missing.
Yeah.
It's a really disturbing trend.
Yeah.
Why target such a wide range of people? What's the point?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's a lot of speculation, of course. Some people think it's an attempt to silence dissent,
Right.
intimidate anyone who's critical of the government,
Yeah.
make them afraid to speak out.
So it's a lot to unpack. I mean, can you imagine those families just waiting, not knowing what happened? It's really scary. And it feels like anyone who speaks up or criticizes, the government's just coming down on them hard.
Yeah, I can see why you'd say that, especially with, some of President Ruto's past statements about democracy having limits and all that.
Right.
And then you've got Senator Okia Omtata. He was arrested.
Yeah.
Just for being part of those protests.
It's not a good look. And it's strange because Kenya, it's often presented as this economic success story, right?
Right.
I mean, even the German Development Ministry calls it the third largest economy in sub-Saharan Africa. But then you read these reports and you see people struggling to afford basic things like extreme poverty.
Yeah.
It's how does that even...
Yeah, it's definitely a paradox. And I think it shows that there's more to the story with Kenya's economy. I mean, yeah, some sectors have seen a lot of growth, but a big chunk of the population, they're not seeing those benefits.
Right.
And that's part of the context here, this economic disparity, all these promises that haven't been kept. That's the backdrop for this wave of violence and repression we're seeing.
And it goes back to that finance bill too, right? Like we were talking about how it would have really hit the poorest people the hardest.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like the system is failing them. It's not meeting their needs.
Exactly. And you see that really clearly in places like the Korogocho slum. That's it's the third largest slum in Nairobi.
Oh, wow.
You're talking about somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 people all crammed into this area that's only 1.5 square kilometers.
That's unbelievable.
And over 60% of the kids there, they have to work on the Dandora garbage dump just to survive.
It's heartbreaking. I mean, you hear about Kenya being this economic powerhouse.
Yeah.
Then you see that it doesn't add up.
Yeah, and it just goes to show that you can't judge a country, a nation's well-being, just by looking at economic numbers. And, President Ruto, he promised to get rid of these slums.
He did, yeah.
But they're still there.
They are.
They're a constant reminder of those broken promises and of this huge gap between the rich and the poor in Kenya.
It's a really complex situation. And what makes it even more worrying is that the Western media, they're barely covering it, especially those abductions. I've been looking at Kenyan news. They have headlines like, are they still alive?
Yeah.
Front page of the Nation, big newspapers.
Yeah.
And here, nothing. Most German outlets, they're totally silent.
That's a problem, a big one. It raises all sorts of questions about how we get our news, like what gets reported, what gets ignored, and why.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, international news, it tends to focus on things that directly affect the West, but there's more to it than that. Well, foreign reporting, it's not cheap.
Right.
It's logistically difficult, and news organizations, a lot of them, they just don't have the budget for it. Not only does it paint this false picture of Kenya, like everything's fine, it's a stable democracy, but it might allow those human rights abuses to continue because nobody's watching.
Yeah, because if those in power realize they can get away with stuff, that there's no international attention, no scrutiny, that's dangerous for anyone who wants to challenge them.
Exactly. And then there's President Ruto himself. His nickname Zakayo. It's pretty telling, I think.
What does it mean? I don't know that one.
It means Zacchaeus. That's a biblical figure, a tax collector.
Oh, okay.
But he was seen as corrupt, exploitative. He got rich by overtaxing people.
Ah, I see.
He did eventually repent, but that initial image, it's stuck.
So they're saying Ruto's like that he's profiting off the system while everyone else is suffering.
That's definitely one way to interpret it. And policies like that finance bill, they feed into that perception, putting more and more pressure on the people who can least afford it.
Right, right. And then you have, experts weighing in, like that communication expert, the one cited by the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, saying that Ruto's policies are actually, they're making things worse for ordinary Kenyans.
Yeah, it's a pretty harsh assessment of his leadership. And it shows that economic growth, it doesn't always mean that everyone's lives are getting better.
It feels like Kenya's at this crossroads, trying to deal with these huge inequalities, and more people are they're losing faith in the political system.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
But all this is happening so far away, thousands of miles away. What does it have to do with us?
Because Kenya might seem far away geographically, but its story is connected to ours more than you might think.
Okay, I'm listening. Tell me more. It's easy to feel like, oh, that's happening over there. It's not really my problem. But you're right. Everything's connected. Even if we don't always see it.
Yeah, for sure. And one of those connections between Germany and Kenya, it's this recent migration agreement. Up to 250,000 Kenyans, they're allowed to come work here now.
I bet a lot of Kenyans are going to be looking for opportunities somewhere else.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about. And that many migrants, it brings up all these questions, right, about our immigration policies here in Germany, about how they integrate into the economy and into society. And it highlights how global issues, they're all linked. Yeah. What happens in Kenya, it doesn't stay there. It ripples out, affects everyone.
It really does make you realize we can't just ignore what's happening in other parts of the world, even if it seems far away. But all this, it can feel so overwhelming. Like, what can we even do as individuals, to actually make a difference in a situation like this?
Yeah, that's a tough one. But even small actions, they can have an impact. Empowering communities.
Like that IERA initiative, right? The one we talked about, doing all that amazing work in the Korogocho slum.
Exactly. They're making a real difference. And they're not alone. There are German organizations, too, like Zukunft für Kinder in slums. They're supporting the IERA initiative. So you can see international collaboration. It's powerful. And you can contribute even from far away.
So donating, that's one thing. What about like petitions?
Yeah.
Or contacting our representatives, the people we elected? Does that stuff really do anything?
It can. It really can. Petitions, they raise awareness. They put pressure on governments to address the issue. And when you contact your representatives, it shows them that people care, that they're paying attention to what's happening in Kenya, and that they want action.
It's a way to make our voices heard, hold those in power accountable. And it doesn't have to be like this big dramatic thing. Sometimes just talking to people, friends, family, coworkers, sharing an article or this deep dive even, that can get people interested, get them thinking, encourage them to learn more.
Absolutely. It's all about widening that circle of awareness, breaking the silence, making it a shared responsibility. And here's a final thought. We've been talking about how Western media, they're not covering this enough, right? But what if we became our own sources of information? What if we actively looked for news from Kenya, from Kenyan sources, followed Kenyan journalists and activists on social media, listened to Kenyan voices directly?
That's a good challenge. It's about taking control of how we understand the world and finding those different perspectives, the ones that we don't always get.
Yeah, because if we really want to understand and then do something meaningful about it, we have to go beyond the surface. We have to dig deeper, and we have to listen to those voices that are so often silenced or ignored.
That's a great way to put it. Well, thank you so much for sharing all this with us, and thanks to everyone listening for joining us on this deep dive into the complexities of Kenya. We hope you come away with more awareness, a deeper understanding, and a desire to stay engaged, to stay informed and active. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Erica and David, for this extraordinary podcast. Sometimes people wonder why the media in liberal countries pay so little attention to what is happening in one of the most important countries in Africa. Thanks to the article of Thomas Schwartz, we now know and understand better what is going on in Kenya. Thank you for this, and hopefully until the next deep dive.